For the next few days, we're going to take a look at the beginnings of what became the Baptist movement. Baptists were born in protest, and we've been dissenters ever since. It all began with a group in England led by Thomas Helwys and John Smith, who separated from the Church of England, the established church. In the established church, what the church leaders said about God took priority over what the Bible says about God. The protest of Smith and Helwys' band of separatists was grounded firmly in an unshakable conviction that only the Bible, not human leaders, whether political or religious, was their rightful authority for understanding and approaching God. The story of John Smith and Thomas Helwys is a brief but compelling one. As Leon Macbeth recounts in his classic history, The Baptist Heritage, Smith, a theologian, had once been ordained a priest in the Church of England. Yet only a few years later, he was thrown into the notorious English prison known as the Clink for refusing to conform to the church's teachings and practices. Thomas Helwys, on the other hand, was a well-to-do layman. These two men apparently met for the first time around 1606, when Smith broke completely with the Church of England and began meeting with a group of fellow separatists in Gainsborough, a group led by, among others, John Robinson, William Brewster, William Bradford, and Thomas Helwys. Ultimately, as Macbeth tells us, the group's size and visibility left it exceedingly vulnerable to persecution by King James I. So, for safety's sake, they broke up into two groups. Both groups migrated to Holland as religious refugees, one group led by Robinson, Brewster, and Bradford, and the other group led by Smith and Helwys. The Smith-Helwys group adopted believers' baptism as its foundational organizing principle and became the First Baptists. In tomorrow's Baptist Brief, we'll continue the story of John Smith, Thomas Helwys, and the very first Baptist church. Yesterday we talked about the first meeting between the two founders of the Baptist movement, Thomas Helwys and John Smith. As Leon Macbeth tells us in the Baptist Heritage, Smith and Helwys weren't yet Baptists when they and their group left England for Amsterdam in 1607. In fact, they formed their church on the basis of an Old Testament covenant and made no provision for believers' baptism. However, by 1609, all of that had changed. Smith now declared that only professed believers should be baptized, and that this conviction, the baptism of professed believers only, would be the foundational principle of the new church that he was forming. In fact, he persuaded the rest of the Smith-Helwys group to formally disband and to then reconstitute their church on the basis of believers' baptism. But there was a problem. None of them, Smith and Helwys included, had been baptized as a believer. So no one had the authority to baptize them. Smith came up with a solution. He baptized himself, thus supposedly conferring upon himself baptismal authority, and then baptized Helwys and about 40 others. Thus, the First Baptist Church in history was formed right there in Amsterdam in 1609. Nevertheless, as we see with so many Baptist leaders through the years, Smith's convictions were constantly evolving. After all, this is the one-time Anglican priest who wound up in jail for resisting the church's teachings, broke with the church completely, wound up as one of its most vocal critics. So he was certainly the prototype for Baptists, because he was constantly arguing, even with himself. In tomorrow's Baptist Brief, we'll see that no partnership is forever. Yesterday, we discussed the baptism of the First Baptist by John Smith. However, only months after baptizing himself, Thomas Helwys, and around 40 followers, Smith renounced his self-baptism, and thus the baptism of all of those he had baptized. As Leon Macbeth tells us in the Baptist Heritage, Smith concluded that his self-baptism was born of a hasty and unwise impulse, and that true baptism must be performed only by someone who had already been baptized as a believer. So he asked the members of that fledgling Baptist church in Amsterdam to repudiate their baptism as well, and to join him in seeking membership in a Mennonite congregation. Many did, but not all. As Macbeth tells us, Thomas Helwys and several others insisted that though Baptists and Mennonites both practiced believers' baptism, there were fundamental differences between the teachings of the two groups that the Baptists could not afford to ignore. Joining the Mennonites would compromise their principles and destroy their Baptist identity. Besides that, they were quite satisfied with the baptism they had received from John Smith. So Helwys and his Baptist remnant took the painful step of asking John Smith and his followers, numbering over 20, to leave their church. By now, Helwys' trust in Smith had been exhausted by Smith's ever-shifting convictions. This was likely the reason for Helwys urging the Mennonites to think twice before accepting Smith as a member. And the Mennonites never did accept Smith's membership application. In the summer of 1612, John Smith fell seriously ill. On August 20th, the man who only 3 years earlier in Amsterdam had been instrumental in founding the First Baptist Church died without membership in any organized church. 2.5 years after Smith's death, the Mennonites accepted his followers as members. John Smith and his followers thus disappeared from history as a separate identifiable group. In tomorrow's Baptist Brief, we'll look at how Thomas Helwys and his group kept the Baptist flame burning. Yesterday, we saw that John Smith died a man without a church, and his followers ultimately became Mennonites. But Thomas Helwys and his small group kept the Baptist movement alive. In 1611, 2 years after the founding of the First Baptist Church in Amsterdam, Helwys led his group back to England. They established their church in Spitalfield, a section of London. As Leon Macbeth tells us in the Baptist Heritage, historians consider this the first Baptist church on English soil. There, the Helwys group summarized their beliefs and practices in a confessional statement that confirmed their continued adherence to the Baptist principles declared by Smith in 1609. In 1612, Helwys published a treatise in which he attacked both the Church of England and the king. He denied the power of the king over people's souls and vigorously defended the principle of religious liberty for all people. Then he sent King James a copy in which he inscribed a personal note to the king on the flyleaf. The king's response was swift and harsh. He had Helwys thrown into Newgate prison, where Helwys apparently died in 1616. When Helwys was thrown into prison, the group turned to John Merton for leadership. Merton also eventually died in prison in 1626, but his leadership and his faithfulness helped to spread the Baptist movement, and he deserves credit for its survival. By 1624, there were at least 5 Baptist churches in England. Evidence of an early missionary spirit among Baptists is their growth to at least 47 churches by 1650. In tomorrow's Baptist Brief, we'll take a closer look at the persecution suffered by Baptists in 17th century England. For the past few days, we've focused on Baptist beginnings, culminating in the essential role that Thomas Helwys, John Merton, and their group played in the survival of the Baptist movement. By 1650, there were at least 47 Baptist churches in England. But survival wasn't easy for these Baptists. Now we turn our focus to the difficulties they encountered in worshiping as Baptists in 17th century England. Keep in mind that the British authorities and the Church of England worked hand in glove to protect each other. Being a British subject meant belonging to the Church of England, and that included presenting your baby to be baptized. but Baptist women would have none of that. In the Baptist Heritage, Leon Macbeth tells us that Baptist women living in houses just outside the Bristol parish would rent rooms to expectant mothers. By giving birth beyond the reach of the parish, the mother was able to escape the forcible baptizing of her infant. Baptist pastors were under siege as well. In the early 1660s, Parliament enacted the Clarendon Code, consisting of 4 statutes aimed at protecting the established church and punishing those who resisted the church and its practices. For Baptist pastors, enforcement of the Clarendon Code meant certain imprisonment. Macbeth writes that churches in Bristol rarely kept a pastor for long before losing him to imprisonment. But Baptists being Baptists, these pastors refused to be intimidated. As soon as one was released, he almost invariably called a church meeting and began preaching again. In Monday's Baptist Brief, we'll look at some of the strategies that these early Baptists devised to protect themselves, their worship, and their pastors from the authorities. In Friday's Baptist Brief, I mentioned that the British authorities' strict enforcement of the Clarendon Code meant that Baptist pastors in the late 17th century were under the constant threat of imprisonment. In the Baptist Heritage, Leon Macbeth tells us that Baptists had to resort to extreme measures just to worship together. One tactic was the use of private homes equipped with trap doors, leading to concealed basement rooms. In July 1675, authorities broke in on a Baptist worship service in one such home and were unable to find the preacher because he had escaped to the basement through a trap door disguised as a bench. In a similar case, as the preacher was escaping, an officer got hold of him by the coat sleeve. But the preacher jumped, the coat slipped off of him, and he escaped. The Broadmead Church in Bristol stationed 1 or 2 young people at the door as lookouts to warn the congregation of approaching constables. Another strategy that these Baptists often used to slow down the authorities was to cluster worshipers on the stairways leading into the house so that the pastor and other worship leaders would have time to get away. Macbeth relates that yet another strategy devised by the Baptists in Bristol was to gather for worship at one house while the pastor preached from an adjoining house, if you can picture that. These Baptists also kept the authorities on their toes by using various tactics designed to avoid alerting authorities that a worship service was taking place, varying the times scheduled for services, wearing clothes that were anything but obvious Sunday go-to-meeting clothes, and arriving and leaving one at a time or in small groups rather than all at once. In tomorrow's Baptist Brief, we'll take a look at the early Baptist insistence on what was a foundational Baptist principle, believer's baptism. For the past few days, we've focused on the persecution suffered by early Baptists in England. Today we turn our attention to believer's baptism, the principle that was at the heart of our Baptist forebears' protest against the Church of England and ultimately gave them their name. From the mid to late 17th century, Baptists authored numerous treatises defending believers' baptism against its critics. In the Baptist Heritage, Leon Macbeth writes that perhaps the most famous battle of what he calls the Watery War involving early English Baptists was waged at Southwark in a 1642 debate between William Kiffin and Daniel Featley. In a treatise bearing the colorful title, The Dippers Dipped, or the Anabaptists Ducked and Plunged Over Head and Ears, Featley mocked Baptist pastors for their lack of formal education. He even accused Baptists of child abuse for denying infants the benefits of baptism. Kiffin responded by asserting that the baptizing of infants was neither taught by Scripture nor practiced by the New Testament church. Macbeth points out that believers' baptism had been part of every Baptist confessional statement from the beginning. Baptists argued for believers' baptism essentially on the basis that the New Testament never teaches that infants are to be baptized. Rather, it teaches that believers are to be baptized, and faith and baptism require a personal decision and commitment that infants are incapable of making.